From newsies hawking headlines on neighborhood streets to the pervasive planet-wide reach of digital media, journalists have long sought to expose the most pressing problems of the time, reporting on conflict, corruption, and the controversies that surround them. But in this rapidly changing media landscape, should journalists do more than just get the facts? Should journalism reveal solutions as it uncovers problems? Should solutions be part of the whole story? I'm Aaron Maybin, and welcome to Diederich Ideas, a student-produced program that brings to light new experiences, new people, and new ideas. So join me today as I sit down with media professionals to get the inside scoop on solutions journalism, the whole story. Welcome to Diederich Ideas. Every week in the New York Times, David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg write the column Fixes that focuses on major social problems. To join with me on the couch, I just want to ask the simple question that's not very simple. What is solutions journalism?
Solutions journalism is a practice, akin to investigative journalism or explanatory journalism, but it focuses on evidence-based, rigorous reporting about responses to social problems. So it really goes deep into the how-tos of how problems are being addressed.
So why should journalists be involved with solutions journalism?
What does it add to our journalism?
Yes, what does it add?
Well, basically, okay, there's a number of things. Most of the time when journalists cover society, they focus on the problems, most coverages. But every problem produces a response. Mm-hmm. So we're saying tell the whole story.
Many responses.
Many responses. And not choosing solutions, but really focusing on, really helping to round out the story. The second thing is that when you cover problems and then you with the associated responses, it actually makes the problems clearer and more understandable. The third thing is it leads to a more constructive debate and probably less polarization about that, because you're getting into not the he said, she said, but the how-tos of how people are responding to them. And finally, it's a way for readers to engage with the news, because readers are constantly telling journalists, it can't all be tunnel, we need some light too. Mm-hmm. So the light is how are people responding to these problems, and then what can we learn from it?
So those four things that you mentioned, it kind of sounds like what a lot of students are learning already in college. How is solutions journalism really putting a twist on it? It pretty much sounds like regular journalism. How is there a twist to it?
Well, the reigning myth of journalism is that our job is to uncover problems. Mm-hmm. And once we've done that, then someone will come in, maybe from Mars, and solve those problems. But I think we can conclude that that model really doesn't work. Okay. And problems don't get solved in society just because people know that they exist. People need models. They need to know that these problems have solutions, that people are responding to them, and how they're doing it, and we need to learn from that. If you don't do that, then what you're basically saying to people is there's only problems, and that just produces passivity and fatalism, and more important for us, people who don't read newspapers.
Okay, David?
And the reason why it's important to have a practice is because problems scream. They call for your attention all the time. If the water main breaks, you have to go cover that story. Mm-hmm. But these solution stories, they often whisper. They're very powerful. They're very important to understand how society is changing, but they're not necessarily grabbing your attention. So you need a special practice to say, hey, what are the responses that we're not looking at? Have we looked at this story from another angle? And that's why the practice of solutions journalism, how do you find these stories? How do you vet them? How do you construct the narratives around these stories is important to codify.
Okay, so why do they tend to shy away, not really become activists at all?
Journalists are very worried about a number of things, about looking like advocates. They're worried about looking like they're writing fluffy journalism and so forth. And we found that a lot of these stories, historically, when journalists do cover them, they come off like good news stories. And I'll give you a bunch of examples of what we call solutions journalism imposters. Mm-hmm. So the classic one is the hero story. When we write these stories, we're saying they're really about ideas and models and intelligence about how problems are being addressed, not about the kindness of strangers. Another classic imposter story is what we call the silver bullet. It's sort of a one-off story. This is one from the New York Times that basically reports on how a new soccer ball is a lifesaver. Mm-hmm.
And that's overclaiming. I mean, that's not good journalism.
It's oversimplified. Mm-hmm. It's reductive. What we see very often is is an imposter we call favor for a friend, which is basically an uncritical look at a company, in this case Tom's Shoes, that is doing something that people think is pretty nice. And so we'll take off our analytic cap and we'll just report what turns out to be kind of a press release. Another one that you often think of is basically the solution story that doesn't have any reporting. It's really just a think piece, and you get these from think tanks all the time. It's, we should change our education policy, and this would be something we should try, without any actual reporting about how that solution would work. Another one is, and this you see all the time, is sort of the afterthought. You've done a long story that investigates a problem, and in the last paragraph you say, oh, by the way, there's this thing that might be working. Or you've done a whole documentary on a problem, and then you say, if you're interested in what can be done about this problem, go check out our website. So, and you see that all the time. So, and then there's the stories that fall into the category of sort of instant activist, where you're basically presenting a problem and you're saying, go tweet about this, or go write a letter, or sign this petition, and so forth. None of these are really investigating the hows and whys of how we are responding, society is responding, and developing new models to address problems. But they make journalists feel allergic to solutions journalism, and so we have to call them out.
And I want to know, you mentioned investigating. How would you compare an investigative reporter to a solutions reporter at all? I mean, I know a solutions reporter is somewhat of an investigative reporter.
Solutions can be a way to frame an investigation. And they almost sound like they're opposites, but they're not. This was a story that ran in the New York Times Sunday magazine, and I first went to my editor and said, I want to write a story about the fact that people in the third world are dying because they can't get AIDS medicines. And my editor said, we are depressed by that story already. It's too familiar. There's nothing fresh in this, not interested. So then I came back to him and I said, well, instead of looking at one of the many countries where people were not getting medicines, let's set it in the one country where people were, which was Brazil. Brazil at the time was providing free AIDS medicines, and it was able to do so because it was making generic copies of brand name drugs. And to do that, Brazil had to overcome a considerable amount of sometimes really sneaky opposition from the pharmaceutical industry and from Washington. So in the course of writing this story, I put into it this investigative piece, which is how the pharmaceutical industry was trying to undercut these lower priced medicines. But it was done in the frame of a solution story, which I think made it a little bit fresher and more interesting.
And do you find that solutions stories typically will make it fresher and more interesting?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I mean, this, you could say that news is the unexpected, in many cases, and those are the angles that most of the time people haven't heard.
So when people are reading the stories, what are some things that they can be looking at to understand the solutions that you guys are talking about?
Okay, it's not happy news.
Okay.
It's about the work. It's about what is going on here that is having a more successful response to a problem and why. So a lot of times journalists will shy away from this because they think that in journalism, excessive cynicism is a misdemeanor, but if you say something's working and it turns out not to be, then it's a felony. So journalists are very scared of seeming to call winners or seeming to make claims that then later might be disproven, especially if they're talking about something that's successful. What we say is you don't have to do any of that. That all solutions journalism is reporting. It's going out to look at something that's going on in the world and talking about what's happening and what effects it's happening. This is an example that comes from a database. If I'm a health reporter in New York and I get this database, which is from New York State, it's cesarean section rates in hospitals, my normal tendency is to find the lowest performing hospital in my area and write about what a bad job it's doing. Here's one, Good Samaritan Hospital on Long Island, 49.4% C-section rate. That's very high. But my story would be much stronger if instead of just going to the negative outlier in the database, I also went to the positive outlier. And there's another Good Samaritan hospital in Suffern, which is a suburb of New York, that has an 18.4% cesarean section rate. So I should add into my story, what is it that Suffern's doing that other places aren't doing that allows them to get these results?
But it sounds like most reporters would put that in there.
I don't think they would.
You don't think
that
so?
is really not part of how reporters at the moment tend to think about stories. We're hoping that they will automatically think, what can I think about including not just the bad example, but also the positive outlier and look at how the positive outlier got to that point.
The other thing is this story would take a little bit more research and reporting in many cases, because to understand how they actually have a lower cesarean rate without compromising patient safety, you have to look into practices in the hospital, you may have to look into demographics, you may have to look into different functions of the hospital, it's a deeper dive, and your editor has to say, I'm willing to let you do that.
I'll give you the time and I'll give you the money, and those things are very scarce in journalism.
So I'm an aspiring investigative reporter. There's people with the same aspirations in this room. How long should they take for a story if they want to get into solutions journalism? It sounds really like a long time.
You can do it in a day if you want. I mean, there are very short solutions stories. We like to talk about one that was about bed bugs in New York City, and it comes out in a little tabloid that people get for free when they walk onto the subways. Very short story, a couple hundred words, probably done in one day. They don't have to be big. They can be just sort of ordinary stories, but they just happen to look at something that is successful, or something that you can learn from them being partially successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is a story that was written by one of our colleagues, Peg Tyre. It was a very popular story in the Atlantic Monthly last year, one of the most popular stories she'd ever written. But when she pitched it to the Atlantic originally, it's a story about a high school in Staten Island that had managed to increase a very significant increase on its writing scores on the Regents in New York City for ninth grade writing, which is very hard. Lots of people have been able to move math, but it's very difficult to move reading and writing scores. So this school had done something very interesting by changing the way they teach writing, and by doing some very interesting things that took a lot of details to explain in the way they use connector words and sentences and so forth. So Peg had pitched this to the Atlantic, and the guy said, this is an interesting story, but there's way too many details in it. We'd have to sort of cut it in half because people would just be bogged down and people wouldn't read it. She said, no, that's exactly what makes it interesting. It's all those details. She said, it's just like the TV show House. You know that the hero is going to solve the case, but you want to know what are all the twists and turns, what are all the barriers, how is he going to creatively move around those barriers. And so Peg wrote this story like a howdunit. Okay. And all the way they face resistance from the teachers, they have to learn this new methodology, you have to understand how it works. It's very, very detailed, and yet it was an absolutely hugely successful story. It had tens of thousands of Facebook likes. It was considered the best feature story by the Education Writers Association and finalist for the National Magazine Award. But when she originally pitched it, the editor said, oh, we don't think that we can run this story. It's not going to go.
So what do they tell their editors when they say they want to do a how-done-it story and they want to do something big like she did?
Well, one selling point is that these kinds of stories are more valuable to society. They add valuable knowledge. To know, for example, in my story about Brazil, to know that there was a country that was able to provide AIDS medicines to its people was useful information. And now every country does it. But Brazil was really the first, and that was very important. So it adds value to the public debate, and it creates a more constructive kind of public debate. Everyone complains about how polarized public debate is. And a lot of stories that you see are sort of built for that. They really are, on the one hand, on the other hand, he said, she said. And a solution story is a little different. It gets people talking about how to do something, rather than the just simply yes or no.
I would say, in the case of this story, The Writing Revolution, I'd say there's 5,000 stories out there that explain how schools are failing to teach English. What am I going to add if I write another one of these stories? We already know that. The public already assumes that. But if I can show this one example of a place that's made progress, and I can explain how they made progress, I'm injecting something into the conversation that's actually quite new and fresh and much needed. And by the way, there's a whole bunch of other examples of when people have done this before and their stories went viral. I mean, for example, our fixes columns at the New York Times, and we deal with hard subjects, with malaria and homelessness and foster care. We're almost always on the most emailed list. Our stories are always going viral, even when we deal with extremely difficult subjects.
And that's because they're solutions-oriented stories.
And I know that your fixes page is in the opinion section. There's a lot of people that call this an opinion. Why is it in that New York Times opinion section?
It's there for technical reasons. That happened to be who we knew when we pitched the column to the New York Times. But in general, this is real reporting that belongs in the news section. Okay. It is news reporting, feature reporting.
We've had lots of journalists who've sort of tweeted about our column with the question mark, why is this not in the news section?
It's heavily
because
reported.
It's heavily reported.
Yeah. But do you see that one day there will be a solutions tab up top in the right corner?
I don't think it's going to go that way. My sense is that this gets integrated into the DNA of reporting. If you're doing good journalism, you're looking at the whole story. I'm covering a problem because it's a pressing issue, the society needs to know about it. I'm also going to look at the responses to that problem, because if I don't do that, what am I doing? I'm giving people a hall of mirrors, portrait of society. I'm just showing them what's broken. And that's not even going to help. People aren't going to roll up their sleeves and go get ready to solve the problem. They're going to, they're going to deny it, or they're going to, avoid it, or they're going to go to the fridge and eat ice cream. And that's how people respond when they just hear problems. They turn away.
What do you see as the future of solutions journalism?
Well, we don't think there's going to be a solutions journalism unit in a newsroom.
Okay.
We really are hoping that this will be a tool that reporters will consider using all the time. They won't use it all the time, but you have to think about whether it's right. And so our goal really is to have this become a tool that is used in newsrooms all over. We have a non-governmental organization called the Solutions Journalism Network that we are now working with various newsrooms around the country to do projects like this. And we've gotten interest from European newspapers as well, and TV, really people from all over the world. So we see a tremendous amount of interest in this, tremendous.
And the way it's going to be integrated in the newsroom, we don't know. There may be some places that set up an investigative unit focusing on solutions. Some newspapers have investigative units that focus just on problems. It's possible. There's also probably going to be a codification of this solution editing function, or the solution editor role, whose job is, in sitting around the table, to ask those questions. Hey, have you thought about this? Have you considered this? Who becomes very knowledgeable about the kinds of questions and the databases and so forth that can be used to sort of feed, to do lead generation around these stories. I think that there's a variety of ways that this is going to happen, just like any other journalism function. It's going to be very broadly applied. And there'll be a community function as well. It's not just for large metro or national. I mean, every community is generating interesting responses, and if they're not generating responses to their own problems, there's other communities that are generating really interesting solutions that are applicable to them, so they could be bringing those solutions into their community, saying, hey, look what's happening in Indianapolis. That's useful for us. So there's a very local angle to this, as well as a very global angle.
Great. So we're going to leave it at that. You guys will join me on the couch later. So now we know the model of the Solutions Journalism Network from Tina Rosenberg and David Bornstein. Up next, we'll be joined by Meg Kissinger and George Stanley of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. For 13 years, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel has investigated flaws and abuses of the Milwaukee County mental health care system. I'm joined with reporter Meg Kissinger and George Stanley of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Thanks for joining us. Meg, I want to start with you right away. What got you interested in investigating the mental health care system?
Well, I have a history in my family of people with mental illness, and many years ago, after my younger brother Danny died, I wrote a story about what that was like for a family to go through a suicide, and in fact it was the second suicide in my family. And it got a big reaction, and I heard from people in Milwaukee who had been through a similar situation and just could relate to what our family had been through. And so I decided there's a story there, and just followed my nose.
And then, so for 13 years you've been doing this. Were you right away, you wanted to find a solution, or did you just want to report on a story?
Well, I didn't really know what I wanted to do at first. I just knew that there were problems there, that families were frustrated at not being able to get better, to communicate better with both their family members' doctors, to get help through the legal system. There were all kinds of barriers to coordinating their care and their help. And there were not a parallel to other kinds of health problems, cancer and diabetes and heart conditions. So I looked at what were those barriers to getting people better mental health care.
Mm-hmm. And then George, is this kind of something that you like to see reporters doing? I know you're the managing editor. Do you like to see reporters doing this? For 13 years working on one thing?
She's actually slipped in a couple other things along the way.
Right.
But what we try to do is work on the best stories we can and the ones that are most important to be working on. And Meg's a great example of someone who has continued to report on a story as we continue to find more and more things about it, and as the solutions don't really come. So we've kept reporting the story because problems don't get solved. So for example, Meg did a fantastic series about 6 or 7 years ago on the appalling state of housing for people with severe mental illness. And when they cleared out the mental hospitals in the 70s and 80s in Milwaukee County, unlike in many areas, there was no effort made to provide people care in those communities where they were sent to when they left the hospital, and they were there to fend for themselves. And Meg found people who couldn't even go to the bathroom on their own, and they're supposed to find their own housing and care for themselves. And so then she went and looked for where's a place that does a better job. Mm-hmm. And she found it in Columbus, Ohio. And since then, they've built hundreds of new, clean apartments in Milwaukee, a coalition of people that have nurses or other practitioners living on house that can help people take their medications, make sure they're being taken care of. And that was just one of the series she's done in the past.
So for both of you, how does this fit the criteria of solutions journalism?
Well, you know what's funny? I went back and looked at the first series that I did with my colleague Dave Umhafer, and that appeared in 2000, so 13 years ago. And we had a very long and involved piece to that on the solutions. In fact, the headline of it was something to the effect of, "So now what can we do?" So we've been at this for quite a long time, and when I went back to read that not long ago, I had chills down my back because they were the precise things that we're still recommending. Mm-hmm. So that is at once disheartening, but it's also a challenge.
How do you find this?
And every time we've covered and had another investigation of the mental health complex, those solutions get recommended. A task force is named. A 190-page report is written. The report talks about emphasizing more community care, like places like Dane County does. And every time nothing actually happens, and we still lead the nation in people getting emergency care after they're so sick, they end up becoming a danger so that the police have to bring them into the mental health hospital. And this year, Meg really went to get at the root of the problem of why does this keep happening, and they keep coming out with reports. The reports keep saying the same things, but nothing gets done.
And you know, I want to put in a little plug for the fact that this was done in tandem here at Marquette, which gave me the room, the elbow room to roll up my sleeves and look deep. Because this doesn't happen lightly. I mean, yeah, you can do a story about bed bugs, which is great, and solutions journalism can be told in short bursts or in medium bursts. This was a deep dive. This was a long look, which involved looking at committee meeting minutes from the 1970s and reports from that era, and a lot of it was bone dry. Mm-hmm. This was not sexy reporting. This was old-fashioned, just dig. And that's where a lot of the answers lie for the solutions that we're looking at.
And data analysis, too, that really showed that Milwaukee is an outlier and leads the nation in only treating at the emergency care level.
That was actually critical. So in the first story that we did that ran in June that looked at the people cycling through the emergency room, which is really where the crux of the problem is in Milwaukee County's knotted mental health system. And it was I was assisted by our data reporter who was dogged and going back to the county again and again for the numbers of patients coming through. And it took forever. I mean, it took over a year. But once we got those numbers, boy, we had the story, because we could say one lady had come back 196 times in 11 years, and that's hard to argue with statistics.
So she's focused on mental health for 13 years and other things too. but why haven't other reporters focused on maybe the Milwaukee County jails or something else that needs solutions as well?
We have done reporting in many other areas too, in investigative journalism. One thing that's kept this one going is a continuing problem. Okay. And one thing that Meg said I think is really important. Even though we've been working on it on and off for 13 years as people continue to die and get broken necks and get abused at the mental health complex, we're still learning, and we've kept learning the whole time, and Meg has kept learning and our colleagues have kept learning. And so I think that we didn't really get to the crux of the political part of the problem, which is all those reports were done, but Meg's really shown this year that the doctors and the reformers who tried to fix the system weren't allowed to by the politicians in charge.
So do you believe that investigating solutions is reporting the whole story?
Well, it makes it a more interesting story. So in our story in June about this problem with what's seemingly intractable problem with people returning to the emergency room, we note in there that they had to look no farther than 90 miles down the road to Madison, which Madison years ago figured out this assertive community treatment. So don't bring patients to the hospital, bring the hospital out to the patients, because that's how people live. And so they've had terrific results there. So that gave both light at the end of the tunnel, as David would say, but also the something for Milwaukee to consider to do.
And I think what Meg has brought to this story that is now leading to solutions is an empathy and really showing people how this affects real people. That people, just because their brains don't work like they're supposed to because of an illness, they're human beings, and they have dreams and they have families who care about them, and they're not getting the help that they need or that they deserve. Where if there was a brain tumor or something like that causing these problems, they would get tons of help. But for some reason, they're almost like modern day lepers in our society, at least in Milwaukee County.
So we've seen how successful this is. There's so much to talk about, but what were your thoughts in the beginning when she kind of pitched this idea to you?
Well, we really had the opportunity, like Meg said, to work with Marquette and really do this as the kickoff to what has become the O'Brien Fellows. And that gave us the freedom to really spend a lot of time and get student help in looking at all those reports, and going to Giel, Belgium, to where there was a place that really cares about folks and has for hundreds of years, and brings them into homes and takes care of them. So when we had that opportunity, we just thought we've got to finally get this fixed.
So Mike, I want to go back to you. Do reporters do they have the responsibility to tell the whole story? Is it their responsibility to tell that whole story? Because you are, but there's thousands of other reporters that aren't doing so.
Well, I don't know the whole story, and I'm still learning it. So I don't think I'm through. Okay. And that's I think the more you dig, the more you think you know, the more you realize you don't know. So you keep digging.
These are very complicated stories and very complicated solutions, but there are people that, and I think that this is what David and Tina were talking about, there are people out there who have made a lot of progress and have solved a lot of these problems that Milwaukee hasn't faced yet. And Meg's done a fantastic job of finding those places and those people that are doing a much better job.
We've heard from George Stanley and Meg Kissinger. Up next, Meg will be joined with Tina and David. We'll be right back. Tina Rosenberg and David Bornstein have joined the conversation with Meg Kissinger. I want to start with you two right away. You heard Meg's model. Does this fit your solutions journalism model?
In my opinion, it's a superb example of exactly what we're talking about. And we want to talk to Meg about how she did it.
Yeah.
because
We want to clone,
let's
we want to
talk
clone,
about the nuts
clone her.
Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of everything she's doing.
Okay. I guess, you had in your series, which was not entirely about solutions, obviously, you
Right.
talked about the issues, the problem. You had very, very gripping multi-part stories about specific cases, one heartbreaking trip to California with one family. But you did talk about several different models of places that were doing this far better than Milwaukee. From very far away, Giel, Belgium, to Houston, Texas, to Madison. So how did you find these better practice examples?
Well, I've known about Giel, Belgium for years. So the National Alliance on Mental Illness each year has a festival here in Milwaukee that they call the Festival of Giel. And I've always been intrigued by this little town outside of Brussels that kindly has cared for people for over 700 years. And that just was fascinating to me. So I knew that was kind of the gold standard, or the Mecca to go, and it was a thrill to be able to go there.
Tell us what they do.
So what they do there is, and it started in a goofy way. It started with a fable about an Irish princess named Dymphna who was beheaded by her father. Now, whether or not that is true is lost to history, but nonetheless, over the years, the people of the town have cared for people with mental illness. And it began at first with a convent, and the nuns took in people that they believed were possessed by the demons. So, and then with that came the call for people around that area to come there and to pray for forgiveness, because way back in the day, mental illness was considered to be an evil. You were possessed by a demon. So whether or not, as the story said, that was a medieval marketing ploy, it worked because people came from all over that area of Belgium. And then over the years, it's evolved into a community-based system. And of course, it's much different today. There are, at one point in its heyday, there were over 3,000 people. 1 in 5 residents were patients, and that is now many fewer. There are something like 300 patients left. So it's a dwindling practice.
And how did you find the specific families that you decided to focus on?
Well, funny story. We went there first to prep. So we went there in October and met with the hospital officials, and they were not about to let us introduce us because of patient confidentiality, etc. But we felt very strongly that this was a very beautiful model, and the spirit of that needed to be told. Well, anyway, we returned home hats in hand and pretty fearful that we'd just blown some good money. But I also had a contact, a professor from Alabama, actually, a woman who had been to Giel many times. And so I called her up and just basically begged. I was practically on my knees and just said, please, can you put me in touch with a family? And she did. And we went there back in January, and they were so gracious in letting us in and spending time with their family, and it turned out quite well.
If you compared telling that story, which is a beautiful story, and the video is beautiful too, and the way you sort of construct a narrative out of something where there's much less conflict and tension. It's really a story about how they live together as a unit, and how they care for each other. And if you compare that to the way you construct the stories that look at how the system is broken, what's different?
Well, there was terrific conflict in getting that story. And so, but I knew that the purpose of that story was to show the spirit, to show that people with mental illness are loved people. And so while that story didn't have conflict, setting it up did. Now these other stories, that conflict was inherent. So we had to, we knew that at the very core of the problem with Milwaukee County's mental health system is this over-reliance on the emergency room care, and how the fallback position, instead of care in the community, is just call the cops, slap handcuffs on the patients, and take them out to the hospital. So how to get behind that? Well, we ran up against big-time interference with that too. And a big breakthrough happened, and I do think it was in no small way because we were aligned with Marquette University. the county hospital administrators agreed to let us come and observe for a day. So that was really useful. Now, what can you see in a day? Not much. And also because of HIPAA concerns, we couldn't, we had our lawyers talk to their lawyers, and it was very programmed. But from that, I could get a great sense of what a typical day would be like.
Now you went to Houston.
So we went to Houston. That was okay, and so that we were just hungry to know, has any other community dealt with how have other communities dealt with this? So there's an excellent group in town working very hard to solve this problem, and they have studied the evidence-based practice that they engage in Houston, and in fact a contingent of Milwaukee police officers and an attorney went down to Houston to look at this model. So we went too. We went after they did, and they were fantastic. They were only too happy to show off their success. And it was, I was so energized by that story, because when you write about a problem, and you've been writing about the same problem for 13 years with a lot of the same players, to see what is working was just so, it just brightened my whole day.
Okay. Can I just?
Go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about, for the students watching this, how you use those data sets to try to how was it working through those data sets to try to understand where you would focus your lens? Was it difficult? Did Houston just jump out, or did you have to really sort of pore over the data?
Regarding Houston?
Yeah.
Well, there they were happy to share their evidence. They go all over the country and talk about their success. And what they do, it's interesting. So they look at who comes through their their emergency rooms, psychiatric emergency rooms, and then who has contact with police officers, and they mesh their information. And so they come up with what they call a chronic consumer stabilization initiative. So they have a list of people who have contacts with both the police and the emergency room. And then their team, so it's not just a police officer, but it's a mental health practitioner, goes out on these mental health calls. And we were able to go out with them. And so that was very helpful to see that. So how did that data, we looked at their outcomes, and we compared that to Milwaukee's, et cetera.
Thank you for that insight. Up next, we're going to keep the conversation going with Hal Burton, an O'Brien Fellow here in Diederich College of Communication.
The O'Brien Fellowship in Public Service Journalism is one of the most innovative programs I know of in the country that brings together professional journalists, students, and a community to benefit from really critical reporting, solutions-focused journalism that at the same time it's creating important stories with high impact for communities, it creates an environment for students to have the opportunity to learn while doing with incredible professionals.
Hal Burton is a reporter for the Seattle Times, spending his time in Milwaukee as an O'Brien Fellow. He's joined the conversation. Hal, my first question is to you. Do you have any concerns about solutions journalism at all?
Well, first I want to say that I think David and Tina have done a lot of really amazing work. They don't just sort of talk about what it is. They write about it every day. And if people haven't seen the Fix It column online in the New York Times, some of the examples of what they do are pretty amazing. And I know sometimes they even get lifted offline and put into print, like a story that Tina did looking at why one hospital was able to make a lot of progress on costs and such. And certainly as I move forward with the O'Brien Fellowship, it's got me thinking on the project I'm looking at, which is efforts to reduce carbon emissions, how I can incorporate some of these things into my work. That said, it doesn't always come forward without some elements, new things, without controversy. And I think at my paper, where we have launched on a very ambitious partnership with David and Tina to look at where there may be education success stories within the Seattle area, a very ambitious project that's funded through the Gates Foundation. I think they're giving more than $400,000, is that correct? Something like that. As David knows, there's been controversy within our newsroom in the new roles, in the new funding sources. I think your comment at one of our meetings was, well, I'm glad it's not all Seattle nice, which I remember. And I think that there's been change, there's been a tremendous support at the top to move forward in a new direction. One of the concerns, and I think, David, maybe you want to chime in on this, has been if we're taking this much money from the Gates Foundation, which is a big, big local institution that at times we may have to cover if there are problems, how does that change the perception that we're sort of honest brokers as we cover the news? So that doesn't speak so much to whether solutions journalism is a good thing or how, you know, a lot of great work may be done, but about the relationships that emerge through the funding.
No, it's a hugely important question, and it's not only important for the Seattle Times, it's important for the whole field of journalism, because there are dozens, scores of news organizations now that are required to take funding from foundations in order to do deep dives and deep investigative pieces like this. They could refuse the money, but then they wouldn't be doing that journalism that they want to do. So the question is, how do they handle it? You know, historically the conflict of interest has been there with the advertising side as well. You cover companies that are big advertisers, so it's not totally new. But with Gates Foundation in Seattle, it's probably the epicenter of this particular problem because Gates is so huge and they're right in your backyard. So I think, you know, when David Boardman first came to us and proposed this project, and
Dave's
we worked
our
it out with him,
executive editor,
the
just
former editor,
excuse me, he just went to
and now in talking with Kathy and Suki, the policy is just radical transparency. Everything, the decisions, you know, the blog is going to be talking about, journalists are going to be talking about their reporting techniques, how they choose stories. They're going to be very, very upfront with readers about clearly what everybody knows on the front page. You know, when the series is going to be announced, they're going to be talking about exactly how it's funded and who it's funding. There's probably going to be another foundation that's going to come in as well, a journalism foundation, we're hoping. But I don't think that there's an easy answer to this question. But the one thing that we know is that if the funding wasn't there, this kind of very deep dive, very similar to what Meg has done with mental illness, wouldn't really have been possible.
Well, I realize that foundations are a very sort of new and increasingly important component in funding journalism. More and more foundations are seeing that as we struggle, that there's a need for that. And certainly NPR, National Public Radio, takes a lot of money from foundations. And I know also ProPublica, another major investigative unit, they're taking a lot of money from, I think, the Gates Foundation as well. As just sort of a journalist who's been in the trenches for a long time, I still am concerned that, so there's this guy inside the Gates Foundation, and he's just discovered that his bosses are embezzling a bunch of money, and he wants to be a whistleblower and call someone up. Folks, this is all theoretical. This has not happened, okay? This is just me imagining. Is he gonna make his first call still, as we would always want, to the Seattle Times to let us know? Or is he gonna say, well, wait a second, they're taking that grant? You know, that's just, maybe that's an unreasonable concern, but it's
Tina, what do you have to say?
Hal, we were at a meeting at the Gates Foundation that David Boardman was at. It was a large group of people, and after introducing himself, David said, and if anybody here has any dirt about the Gates Foundation, bring it to me. I mean, that was a joke, but I mean, clearly this is an issue that people are very aware of.
I would say that Hal is asking great questions. What other controversies are naysayers saying as well? I mean, this is really important.
Well, this is not a question that's particular to solutions journalism. This is a question that, as David said, all journalists are wrestling with now. Gates Foundation has financed most of the public health coverage in major media in the United States now for the past few years. That's unfortunately with the business model for news organizations tanking, foundations are coming in to fill the gap, and this is raising these kinds of questions. But what do you have, tell us about a criticism you have of solutions journalism, particularly, Hal.
In general, I'm not a critic of what you guys are doing. I think that it's opening up a lot of good work, opportunities, and ways of thinking about things. And I think at times, part of solutions journalism may be knocking down things that appear to be solutions but aren't. I think that all fits within the model. Things that have been touted as being really good, and when you start looking at them, you see maybe they don't deserve the hype, but something over here that's less involved, that's less touted, might be a really good model. Or it may be looking at, when I was very young, I got really intrigued with what was then called the gasohol industry. It was I was just starting off in my career, and it was an oil crisis, and oil prices were rising, and guys were making alcohol fuel out of in stills. And that made some good, early copy. Wow, how could this contribute? And I got so interested in it that I started researching in the history of alcohol fuels. I ended up writing a book that was published about the history of alcohol fuels, but writing it with the idea that there's some really good things that could come from it, but there are also a lot of problems. And this was written, I said in the introduction, in the hopes that looking at the problems honestly could help it kind of move forward to a more positive future. And the book was published in 1982, and it was republished, actually, came out at the University of Nebraska Press just a few years ago. And of course, by then, gasohol had become this huge controversy, with a lot of the issues we looked at back then becoming even bigger. So it kind of shows me, like, be careful what you wish for. That as solutions emerge, new issues arise sometimes, or not solutions, but as things that are going right, and then you have to cover those as well.
You raise a really good point, which is that there is no perfect solution. Everything has flaws, and it's the job of the reporter to set that out and to not overclaim. And Meg, you had this issue in one of the stories that you wrote.
Right. I mean, I think that every step along the way, we don't know everything about, what everybody's up to. So even in Giel, for example, so I go to visit this family and spend some time with them. I don't know what goes on the other 360 days a year. So we just have to frame it, this is what we saw, this is the tradition. We did a story about a woman who takes people in Milwaukee. I know her in a very limited way, so we cannot oversell that. This is somebody who's doing a kind thing for people, and we limit it to that this is, I think that an excellent thing that you guys have talked about is not overclaiming, not overselling something.
So Megan, Hal, have you guys ever worried about being known as advocates by people?
Well, sure. I mean, that's a hallmark for a reporter, is to present all sides. But am I, because I've had mental illness in my family, am I presenting a point of view? Of course I am. I would be, foolish to claim otherwise. I can represent what families go through, and if my advocacy is, helping to make people understand better what the frustrations and heartache are for people that live with mental illness, that's who I am. If you're transparent about that, I think you're okay.
I think it's important to clarify what I'm hearing. There's a big difference between saying I'm an advocate for helping people with mental illness and for reducing the pain and suffering that our society causes. I'm a total advocate for solving that problem. I'm not an advocate for that this model is the only or the best way to do it, or that this model, which seems to be working very well, will continue to be the best way to do it 5 years from now as society changes. But this is what I'm seeing. And I see your reporting as very, very, very much based on exactly what you've seen, which the data, the evidence, and all that, putting it together and saying this appears to be what we can look at. This appears to be a response that we should really learn from, and it's not claiming more than that.
Yeah.
And it's really authoritative. It really shows, that's a product of how well you know this issue, but it's also how you write it. You've written it in a way that gives you huge credibility.
Well, thanks. And I think paramount to that is to appreciate what I don't know. And there are a lot of people that have pretty good answers that deserve attention. And that is, I feel like that's my role, is as a reporter, is to draw out what are some solutions that other people have. and try to get to it that way.
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
please.
Hal? With the solutions frame now and your project looking at the climate change and greenhouse gases, how has this frame influenced the way that you're imagining, pursuing your journalism?
I'm looking at efforts to reduce carbon emissions both in this country and hopefully we're getting to China. And obviously there's not going to be one solution, but what I start to see emerge are threads, important things that I need to pay attention to and explore further. And it has helped, I'm not going to shy away from chronicling, failed efforts if they were billed as really important efforts that were supposed to lead the way and they're not. But then I'm going to look, okay, that didn't work. Is there something out here that might work? And so it's really strengthened that end of it. And then the other thing is, as I look at things, I'm starting to see that sometimes on the policy political front, there are things that reasonable people seem to think would really help. But they're reasonable in terms of scientists. On the political front, there's off limits. And I'm thinking that because of the way we're approaching this, even though these types of ideas might be politically off limits, if there's good data, like you're saying, and there are some really smart folks at MIT working on some of these policy fronts that I can find and look at and make a case for, I'll bring them up even if the politics over here say, no way, Jose, because it's not really my role to say it's politically not feasible at this moment, so I'm not going to examine that if the empirical data is saying otherwise. So I think those are the main ways, but actually that's probably a lot.
So before we end, I want to ask you guys, what do you find as the future of solutions journalism? I know I asked you guys this. Hal and Meg, what do you think is the future of solutions journalism?
Well, obviously at my paper it's got a pretty big immediate future, given the collaboration with these two folks and the support from the Gates Foundation. I think we will have to weather some controversy, as I know they're preparing their sort of initial column to explain it all now, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of back and forth and debate, but I look forward to what's going to be happening the next few years, and of course, so I think in my little world it's going to actually be a pretty big thing.
And I would say in mine, we've been doing this for years and we'll continue to do it, and it's we embrace other people climbing onto this train that we've been riding for quite a long time.
Thank you all for joining us on Diederich Ideas for this inside look on solutions journalism, the whole story.